The first time my mother called me her daughter in 15 years, she was standing outside my uncle's lawyer's office, dressed for grief, smiling for money. She looked me up and down like I was still 13. Still inconvenient. Still temporary. Still someone she could move out of the way. "Diana," she said softly, like we were two women reconnecting after a misunderstanding, instead of one woman facing the child she once left on a porch with two trash bags and no plan. Behind her stood my father, quiet as always. My sister stood a few feet back, arms folded, avoiding my eyes. And next to them was a private attorney holding a leather briefcase, calm and polished, as if he already knew how this afternoon would end. They had come to my Uncle Harold's will reading expecting money. Not closure. Not regret. Not accountability. Money. And for a brief second, as the elevator doors closed behind them and the hallway fell still, I understood something with painful clarity. They had not come because they missed Harold. They had not come because they had lost family. They had come because they believed blood still gave them access to what kindness had built. They were wrong. If you know what it feels like to have people remember your name only when they need something, then you already understand the kind of silence I was standing in that day. And if quiet strength means something to you, subscribe and stand for dignity. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was offering peace. "We should talk before this starts," she said. "There are things families need to handle privately." Family. That word nearly made me laugh. Because the truth was, my family had ended on a humid summer night in Portland when I was 13 years old, sitting on the front steps of my parents' house, watching the porch light stay off while my mother decided I was no longer her responsibility. To understand why she looked so confident that morning, and why that confidence wouldn't survive the hour, you need to go back to the summer she gave me away and expected life to move on like nothing happened. The truth is, I didn't realize I was the unwanted child all at once. It came slowly, in small moments that didn't look like anything on the surface but felt like everything when you were living inside them. I grew up in a modest house in southeast Portland, the kind where everything worked just well enough, and nothing was ever replaced unless it completely broke. My father, Richard Myers, worked long hours as an auto mechanic. He wasn't cruel, he just disappeared into whatever my mother decided was right. And my mother, Sandra, she ran our home like a system. Efficient, controlled, selective, especially when it came to love. My sister, Tiffany, was 2 years older than me, and from the outside, she looked like she belonged exactly where she was. Blonde hair, bright eyes, easy laughter. People noticed her. They commented on her. They connected her to my mother instantly. "She looks just like you," they'd say. And my mother would smile in a way I never saw directed at me. I didn't look like her. I didn't sound like her. And over time, it became clear I didn't fit into whatever version of family she had in mind. It showed up in ways that were easy to ignore if you weren't the one experiencing them. When Tiffany turned 15, the house filled with people. There were decorations, a custom cake, music, laughter that spilled into the street. 3 months later, when I turned 13, it was just the four of us at the kitchen table. The cake had someone else's name scraped off. No one mentioned it. And I remember thinking, not angrily, not even sadly, just quietly, "This is probably normal." Some of you listening right now know exactly what that feels like. Not the big moments, but the quiet ones that teach you where you stand without anyone ever saying it out loud. I learned early not to ask for too much, not to expect symmetry, not to compare, because every time I did, I got the same answer in different forms. Tiffany needed things. I was supposed to manage without them, and for a long time, I did. I adapted. I stayed quiet. I made myself smaller so the imbalance didn't feel as obvious. But there's something about growing up that changes how you interpret things you once accepted. And for me, that shift started the year I turned 12. That was the year I realized the difference between being loved and being tolerated. I found out about Tiffany's college fund by accident. It wasn't something anyone sat me down to explain. There was no conversation, no careful moment of honesty. Just a bank envelope left half open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen. But when I saw my sister's name printed neatly across the statement and a balance that didn't make sense for a teenager, I paused. $12,000. I remember staring at that number, trying to understand what it meant. Not just the money, but the intention behind it. 8 years of planning. 8 years of saving. 8 years of someone believing in her future. That night at dinner, I asked about it. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "Do I have one too?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. My mother looked at me like she hadn't prepared for that possibility. "Tiffany needs help for college," she said finally. "You'll figure something out. You're good at adapting." She said it like it was a compliment, like being overlooked was somehow a strength. And maybe that was the moment everything shifted for me. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else could see. But internally, something settled into place. I stopped waiting for fairness. I stopped assuming things would balance out eventually. Because they weren't going to. Some of you listening have had that exact realization, that quiet understanding that no one is coming to even the scale for you. And when you see it clearly for the first time, it doesn't feel like anger. It feels like clarity. From that point on, I started paying attention differently. To how decisions were made. To who got considered first. To how easily I was expected to adjust. And once you see a pattern like that, you can't unsee it. But even then, I didn't think I would ever leave that house. I thought I would stay, keep adapting, keep shrinking where necessary, until I was old enough to quietly disappear on my own terms. I didn't know that my life was about to change much sooner than that. Because a few months later, something unexpected happened. For the first time in my life, an opportunity showed up that had nothing to do with my family, and everything to do with me. The application sat open on the library computer for almost 20 minutes before I touched the keyboard. It was for the Oregon STEM Summer Academy, a 6-week residential program at Oregon State for students who showed exceptional promise in science and math. I read that phrase over and over. Exceptional promise. No one had ever used words like that about me before. Not at home, anyway. At school, it was different. Teachers noticed things. They said I was focused, curious, consistent. But those words never seemed to follow me through the front door of our house. So I didn't tell anyone I was applying. I filled out every section, quietly: grades, essays, recommendations. I wrote about problem solving, about how numbers made sense in ways people sometimes didn't. I hit submit, and then I closed the browser like it had never happened. Because hope in that house was dangerous. Weeks passed. I forgot about it, or at least I told myself I had. Until the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in May, mixed in with grocery store coupons and utility bills. My name was printed clearly across the front. I waited until I was alone to open it. Congratulations. That was the first word. Out of over 2,000 applicants across the state, 50 had been selected. I was one of them. The program covered everything: tuition, housing, materials. It was valued at over $4,000. But that wasn't the part that made my hands shake. It was the idea that somewhere, someone had looked at me, just me, and decided I was worth investing in. For a few hours, I let myself feel it. Pride. Relief. Something close to belonging. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, reading the letter again and again, like it might disappear if I looked away too long. That afternoon was quiet, peaceful, even. And maybe that's why it stayed with me. Because it was the first time I experienced validation that didn't come with conditions. Some of you listening know how rare that feels when someone believes in you without asking you to shrink first. When you don't have to earn your place by sacrificing yourself. But moments like that, they don't always stay untouched. That night at dinner, everything changed. Because Tiffany found out about a different opportunity. And suddenly my future wasn't just mine anymore. Tiffany brought it up casually, like it wasn't something that would change everything. Her drama teacher had recommended her for a performing arts summer program in California, 3 weeks, intensive training, great for college applications. She said it while passing the salt. "I think I should go," she added, almost as an afterthought. My mother didn't hesitate. "That sounds perfect for you. No questions about cost. No pause. No, we'll think about it." Just immediate approval. I sat there quietly, my acceptance letter folded in my pocket, suddenly feeling heavier than it had that afternoon. Then my mother turned to me. "There's something we need to discuss." That was the tone she used when decisions had already been made. "We can't afford to send both of you to summer programs," she said. "So Diana, you'll decline yours." She said it like she was assigning chores, like it was obvious, like it required no explanation. I remember staring at my plate, watching my reflection bend slightly in the curve of the spoon. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought they might hear it. And then, before I could stop myself, "No," the word slipped out. Soft, but clear. The room went still. Even my father looked up. My mother blinked once like she hadn't heard correctly. Excuse me? I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not rebellion, just refusal. This scholarship isn't money you're paying, I said, my voice shaking but steady enough. I earned it. It's mine. That was the moment everything broke. Because it wasn't really about the program. It was about me stepping out of the role I had quietly accepted for years. The one where I adjusted. The one where I gave things up. The one where I didn't challenge decisions. My mother's expression changed slowly. If you can't make sacrifices for this family, she said, her voice lowering, then you're not part of this family. At 13, I thought she was being dramatic. I thought it was just another argument. I didn't understand that some people don't say things like that as threats. They say them as decisions. And looking back now, that was the first time I chose myself. It just took me a few more days to understand what that choice would cost. 3 days later, I came home to silence. Not the normal kind. Not the quiet that comes from an empty house or people being out. This silence felt arranged. Deliberate. The front door was locked when I tried it, which wasn't unusual, but when I knocked, no one answered. I remember checking the time just after 6 in the evening. My mother should have been home from work. I knocked again. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the bags. 2 black garbage bags sitting neatly on the porch, tied at the top. For a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw my sneakers through the thin plastic. My school hoodie. The edge of a notebook I recognized. My stomach dropped. The door opened behind them. My mother stood there, arms crossed, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the moment. I called Harold, she said. He's coming to get you. I blinked. What? Her voice didn't change. You said you weren't willing to be part of this family. So this is what that looks like. It didn't feel real. Not yet. I kept waiting for something for her to soften, to correct herself, to say this was temporary. But she didn't. You can't stay here, she added. From now on, you're his responsibility. Behind her, I could see my father standing in the hallway. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. And then he looked away. I think that part stayed with me more than anything else. Not the bags. Not the words. But the way he chose silence. I looked up toward the second-floor window. Tiffany was there, half hidden behind the curtain, watching. When our eyes met, she stepped back, disappeared. No one came outside. No one said goodbye. Some of you listening know this kind of moment, the one where everything changes but no one names it, where the people who are supposed to stand up for you don't. I sat down on the porch steps next to those bags. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, trying to understand what I had done that was so wrong. Time passed slowly. The sky got darker, and at some point, I realized something that would stay with me for years. No one was coming back out. I wasn't waiting to go back inside anymore. I was waiting to be taken somewhere else. I stayed on that porch for 4 hours, from early evening until the streetlights came on and the neighborhood went quiet. No one turned the porch light on. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. Because it wasn't just about visibility, it was about being seen. And I wasn't. At some point, the air got colder. I pulled my knees to my chest and leaned against one of the garbage bags, trying to make myself smaller, like maybe that would make the situation feel less real. Cars passed. Neighbors walked their dogs. No one stopped. And inside the house, life continued without me. I could see the flicker of the television through the front window, shadows moving, plates being cleared. Normal things, like I had already been erased. Some of you listening have lived through moments like that, the quiet kind of abandonment, where nothing explodes, but everything shifts permanently. Around 10 o'clock, headlights turned into the driveway. A gray Honda. I didn't recognize the car at first, but when the engine shut off and the driver's door opened, I knew. Uncle Harold. He stepped out quickly, scanning the porch, and when his eyes landed on me, something in his expression broke. Not anger, not confusion, just immediate understanding. He didn't ask questions right away. He walked up the steps and pulled me into a hug so tight it caught me off guard. And that's when I finally cried. Not because of what had happened, but because someone had shown up. Hey, he said quietly, one hand on the back of my head. I've got you. 3 words. That was it. But they felt more solid than anything I had heard in that house for years. He didn't ask me to explain. He didn't ask what I did. He didn't need the story to decide I mattered. We loaded the bags into the back seat without much conversation. I didn't look back at the house, not because I was strong, but because I wasn't sure I could handle seeing it one more time. As we pulled away, I stared out the window, watching the place I had spent my entire life disappear behind us. I thought I was leaving home. I didn't realize yet. I was finally being taken somewhere I actually had one. The drive to Seattle took a little over 3 hours. We didn't talk much at first. Not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of us rushed to fill the silence. And for the first time in my life, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt safe. I watched the highway lights blur past the window, my reflection faint in the glass. Every now and then, I'd glance over at Uncle Harold. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, his expression calm, like he had already decided something long before he picked me up. About an hour into the drive, he finally spoke. "You don't have to explain anything tonight." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until he said it, because I had already started preparing answers in my head. "What did you do wrong? Why did this happen? Could you have handled it differently?" Questions I'd been trained to expect. But he didn't ask any of them. "You're tired," he continued. "We'll figure everything else out later." I nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. That word we felt unfamiliar. Some of you listening know what it's like to suddenly be included after years of being treated like an extra. It's disorienting at first, but also grounding in a way you didn't know you needed. We stopped once for gas. He bought me a bottle of water and a sandwich without asking if I was hungry. I didn't realize how much I needed that either. Because in my house, even basic needs sometimes came with conditions. By the time we crossed into Washington, I had stopped replaying the porch in my head. Not because it didn't matter anymore, but because something else was starting to take its place. Possibility. When we finally pulled into his neighborhood in Ballard, it was past midnight. The streets were quiet, lined with small houses and dim porch lights that actually stayed on. He parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and looked at me for the first time since we left. "From now on," he said gently, "you have a home." No hesitation. No qualifiers. No expiration date. Just certainty. And something in me, something that had been bracing for rejection my entire life, finally loosened. I followed him inside. I didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't just an ending. It was the first time my life started to feel like it belonged to me. Uncle Harold's house wasn't big, but it felt open, not just in space, but in energy. There was no tension in the walls, no quiet pressure to behave a certain way, no sense that I needed to earn my place just by existing. He showed me to a small room at the end of the hallway. "This is yours," he said simply. "Yours." I stood in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, just looking at it. A bed. A desk. A window facing the street. Nothing extravagant. But no one had ever given me something and called it mine without conditions. "You can change anything you want," he added. "We'll get you settled this weekend." I nodded, not trusting my voice. That first night, I didn't unpack. I slept on top of the covers in my clothes, like I might need to leave quickly, because part of me still believed this was temporary. That something would go wrong. That I would do something, say something, and this would disappear too. But it didn't. The next morning, Uncle Harold made breakfast. Actual breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. He didn't ask if I could cook. He didn't tell me to clean up first. He didn't hand me a list of expectations. He just included me. We sat at the table in comfortable silence for a few minutes before he spoke. "I'll take care of the paperwork," he said. "School transfer, guardianship, all of that." I froze slightly at that word. Guardianship. It sounded official. Permanent in a way I hadn't processed yet. "You don't need to worry about any of it," he continued. "Your job is just to be a kid again." A kid. I almost smiled at that, because I didn't feel like one. I felt like someone who had just been removed from her own life and dropped into a different one without warning. But over the next few days, something started to shift. Slowly, quietly. He took me shopping for clothes that actually fit, set up my school registration, asked about my classes not to judge but to understand. And every time I expected a condition to follow, there wasn't one. Some of you listening know how strange that feels when kindness isn't followed by a cost, when support doesn't come with a hidden expectation. It takes time to trust that. I didn't trust it right away. But I started to notice something. I was sleeping better, thinking more clearly, breathing easier. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I deserved to stay. I was just staying. School felt different almost immediately. Not because it was easier, but because I was different inside it. At Ballard High, no one knew who I used to be. No one knew the version of me that stayed quiet at dinner, that avoided asking questions, that adjusted herself to fit into spaces that never really made room for her. Here, I didn't have to carry that version anymore. On my second week, my math teacher pulled me aside after class. "You're ahead," she said, flipping through my test. "Have you ever considered joining the advanced track?" I hesitated for a second. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't used to being invited into things like that. "I don't know," I said honestly. She smiled. "Think about it. You don't need permission to be good at something." That sentence stayed with me longer than she probably intended, because for most of my life everything had required permission, even confidence, even ambition. At home with Uncle Harold, things were just as steady, not overly emotional, not overly involved, just consistent. He didn't hover, he didn't control, but he paid attention. One evening, about a month after I moved in, he knocked lightly on my door. "Got a minute?" I nodded, setting my homework aside. He stepped in, holding a printed document. "I found this in your bag when we unpacked," he said, handing it to me. It was my STEM Academy acceptance letter. I had almost forgotten about it. Or maybe I had pushed it aside because it felt like something that belonged to a different life. "You still want to go?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, because it wasn't framed as a decision for him. It was a question for me. I don't know if it's still possible," I said. He shrugged slightly. "Only one way to find out. No pressure. No expectation. Just support." Some of you listening know how powerful that shift is when someone stops telling you who you should be and starts asking who you want to become. That night, I reread the letter. And for the first time since everything happened, I let myself consider the possibility again. Not as something I had to fight for, but as something I was allowed to choose. And that changed everything. I called the program office the next morning. My hands were steady, but only because I had learned how to hide the shaking. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "My name is Diana Myers. I was accepted into the Oregon STEM Summer Academy, and I wanted to ask if my spot is still available." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear typing. A few clicks. "Yes," the woman said. "We've been waiting to hear back from you." Waiting. Not replacing me. Not moving on. Waiting. Something inside my chest loosened in a way I didn't expect. "I'd like to accept," I said. That was it. No argument. No negotiation. No one telling me to step aside. When I hung up, I just sat there for a second, staring at the wall. Because it felt unfamiliar making a decision about my life and having it stand. That evening, I told Uncle Harold. He didn't make a big deal out of it. No dramatic reaction. No speech. He just nodded once. "Good," he said. "Let me know what you need." And that was the thing about him. He didn't celebrate me in loud ways. He supported me in quiet, consistent ones. Over the next few weeks, we got everything ready. Travel forms, packing lists, orientation details. But more than that, something else was happening. I was starting to trust my own choices. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to notice the difference. Because for the first time, I wasn't adjusting myself around someone else's priorities. I was building something that belonged to me. Some of you listening know how strange that shift feels at first when your life stops revolving around survival and starts moving toward possibility. It can feel almost unfamiliar, like you're stepping into a version of yourself you were never allowed to meet before. The night before I left for the program, I stood in my room in Ballard, looking at the same suitcase I had packed just weeks earlier when I thought I had nowhere to go. Same person. Same hands. Different life. Uncle Harold knocked lightly on the door. "You ready?" he asked. I took a breath. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." And for once, I believed it. If this part of the story feels close to something you've lived through, learning to trust yourself after years of being overlooked, tell me where you're listening from. I read more of those messages than you might think. And sometimes your story helps someone else feel a little less alone. The Oregon STEM Summer Academy didn't feel real at first. Not because it was overwhelming, but because it was equal. No one there knew my past. No one had expectations tied to who I was supposed to be. We were all just students who had been chosen. And for the first few days, I kept waiting for the imbalance to show up. For someone to be favored. For someone else to be quietly pushed aside. But it didn't happen. In my physics lab, everyone got the same equipment. In math sessions, everyone's ideas were heard. In group discussions, no one talked over you just because they could. It was subtle, but it was different. And I didn't realize how much I had adapted to inequality until I experienced what it felt like without it. During the second week, we were assigned a team project, something complex involving data modeling and predictive analysis, the kind of work that required not just knowledge, but confidence. Old habits showed up quickly. I started stepping back, letting others lead, waiting to be asked, until one of my teammates stopped me. "Hey," he said, "you keep solving things in your head and not saying them out loud." I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "You're right most of the time. You should probably say something. No judgment. No criticism. Just observation." And that moment stayed with me. Because I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't just overlooked in my old life. I had learned to overlook myself. Some of you listening know exactly what that feels like when you've spent so long shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. You forget how to take up space even when it's finally offered to you. So, the next time we met as a group, I spoke up. Not loudly. Not perfectly. But enough. And nothing bad happened. No one shut me down. No one dismissed me. Instead, they nodded. Adjusted. Built on what I said. That was the moment something shifted again. Not externally. Internally. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was participating. By the end of the 6 weeks, I didn't feel like the same person who had sat on that porch with 2 garbage bags. Not stronger in a dramatic way. Just more certain. Certain that I had value outside of someone else's opinion. Certain that my voice didn't need permission to exist. When Uncle Harold picked me up at the end of the program, he looked at me for a second before saying anything. "You seem different," he said. I smiled. Just a little. "I think I am." And for the first time, that change didn't scare me. When I came back from the program, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became steady, and that steadiness changed everything. School picked up where it left off, but I moved through it differently now. I joined the advanced math track my teacher had suggested. I signed up for the math club without overthinking it. I stopped waiting to be invited into spaces I had already earned. It wasn't confidence in the loud sense. It was quieter than that. More like permission. At home, Uncle Harold never asked for updates in a way that felt like pressure. He'd check in while making coffee or reviewing paperwork at the kitchen table. "How's school?" "Good." "What are you working on lately?" And I'd tell him about equations, projects, things I used to keep to myself. He always listened. Not with surprise. Not with skepticism. Just interest. That consistency built something I hadn't realized I needed. Trust. Not just in him. In myself. By senior year, things had shifted in a way that felt almost unreal compared to where I started. Valedictorian. President of the math club. A 4 gigapascals that wasn't about proving anything anymore, it was just the result of showing up fully as myself. When college acceptance letters came in, I opened them at the same kitchen table where I had slowly rebuilt my life. The University of Washington was the one that mattered most. When I saw the word congratulations, I didn't freeze the way I had with the STEM letter years earlier. I just exhaled, like something had come full circle. Uncle Harold read the letter quietly, then looked up at me. "That's a good school," he said. It was his version of pride, and I understood it. College wasn't just an academic step. It was the continuation of something we had both chosen that night he picked me up. A different life. At the Foster School of Business, I focused on finance. Not because someone told me it was practical, but because I liked understanding how things worked beneath the surface. Systems, structure, long-term decisions. It made sense to me. During my sophomore year, Uncle Harold offered me an internship at Myers Property Holdings. "Nothing special," he said. "You'll start at the bottom." I appreciated that. Because I didn't want anything handed to me. I wanted to learn it the way he had built it from the ground up. Data entry. Lease reviews. Tenant calls. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And over time, I started to see the patterns. How small decisions affected long-term outcomes. How consistency mattered more than big moves. How integrity wasn't something you talked about, it was something you practiced quietly over years. By the time I graduated, I wasn't just stepping into a career. I was stepping into something that had been built with intention, something I understood, something I respected, and more importantly, something I was ready for. Because this time, no one had to make space for me. I had grown into it on my own terms. After I graduated, I didn't go straight into working full-time with Uncle Harold. That would have been the easy path, and he knew it. Instead, he encouraged me to step outside of what was familiar. "You should see how other people do it," he said one evening, reviewing documents at the kitchen table. "It'll make you better when you come back." So I took a position at an accounting firm in Seattle, Mitchell and Partners. It was demanding. Long hours. Tight deadlines. No room to hide behind potential. For the first time, I was in a space where no one knew my history with Harold. I wasn't his niece. I wasn't someone who had been given an opportunity. I was just another junior analyst expected to perform. And I did. Not because I was trying to prove anything anymore, but because I had learned how to show up consistently. Those 18 months shaped me in ways I didn't expect. I learned how to handle pressure without shutting down, how to communicate clearly, even when I wasn't the most experienced person in the room, how to take responsibility for mistakes without letting them define me. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I earned my CPA. The night I passed the final exam, I didn't celebrate loudly. I went home, sat at the edge of my bed, and just let it settle. Another quiet milestone. Another step forward that didn't require anyone's permission. A week later, Uncle Harold called. "Dinner tonight?" he asked. I already knew. When I walked into his house, nothing looked different, but the conversation was, "I think you're ready," he said simply. "For what?" He slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer. Controller at Myers Property Holdings. Full responsibility for financial operations. Oversight of reporting, budgeting, long-term planning. I looked up at him. "You're sure?" He didn't hesitate. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't. That was his way. No long speeches. No inflated praise. Just trust, clear and direct. I accepted. Not because it felt like a reward, but because it felt like the next right step. The transition wasn't effortless. Stepping into a leadership role meant making decisions that affected real people, tenants, employees, partners. There were moments I questioned myself. Moments I stayed late, reviewing numbers over and over again, making sure I hadn't missed something. But I didn't back away from it. Because I understood something by then. Confidence doesn't come before responsibility. It grows through it. By 2021, I stepped into the role of CFO. Not overnight, not dramatically, just gradually, as the work demanded more and I grew into it. On my 26th birthday, I was managing a portfolio valued at over $23 million. I remember sitting in my office that day, looking at the numbers on the screen. Not overwhelmed. Not even proud in the way people expect. Just grounded. Because everything I had built had come from choosing myself when it mattered most, and staying with that choice, even when no one else understood it. For 15 years, my biological family existed like a closed chapter. Not dramatic, not painful in a constant way. Just finished. They reached out 3 times during that period, and each time, it told me exactly what I needed to know. The first was in 2012. I was still in high school, adjusting to a life that finally felt stable. Uncle Harold got the call, not me. My mother didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask if I had settled in. She asked for money. $5,000. My father had lost his job at the auto shop. Things were difficult. She assumed Harold would help because that's what family does. That was her reasoning. Uncle Harold listened quietly, then declined. After he hung up, he stood in the kitchen for a long moment before speaking. "They didn't ask about you," he said. Just that. No anger. No lecture. But the weight of it stayed with me. Because it confirmed something I had already started to understand. I hadn't been missed. The second time was in 2016. By then, I was in college. The envelope arrived in the mail with a Portland return address. Inside was a wedding invitation. Tiffany's. No handwritten note. No message. Just my name printed formally, as if we were distant acquaintances. I looked at it for a long time. Not hurt. Not even surprised. Just aware. Aware that this wasn't an attempt to reconnect. It was a gesture that checked a box. I didn't go. I didn't respond. And I didn't feel guilty about it. The third time was in 2020. That one came directly to me. An email from my mother. Subject line, checking in. I remember staring at the screen before opening it, already knowing what I would find. She mentioned an article. Something about Myers Property Holdings expanding into the East Side market. She said she hoped I was doing well, that maybe we should catch up sometime. It was written carefully, neutral, almost polite, but there was something underneath it, an awareness. She knew where I was now, what I had become, and suddenly, contact felt appropriate. I read it once. Then I deleted it, not out of anger, but because I didn't see a reason to reopen something that had already been closed. I wasn't holding on to resentment. That part had faded over time. What remained was clarity. And clarity doesn't require confrontation. It just requires consistency. By the time 2024 arrived, my life had a rhythm to it. Work, growth, stability. Myers Property Holdings had expanded steadily. Under my oversight, the portfolio had grown in both value and efficiency. Occupancy rates were strong. Tenant relationships were solid. And through all of it, Uncle Harold remained exactly who he had always been. Present. Not intrusive, not distant. Just there. Until the summer, everything shifted again. It started with a routine checkup, something that wasn't supposed to mean much. But by the end of that week, we were sitting in a quiet office at Swedish Medical Center, listening to a cardiologist explain terms that didn't leave much room for interpretation. Congestive heart failure. Advanced stage. 12 to 18 months. I remember the stillness in that room more than the words themselves, the way time seemed to slow, the way everything that had felt stable suddenly wasn't. I looked at Uncle Harold, waiting for some kind of reaction. But he didn't panic. He didn't ask 100 questions. He just nodded once, like he had already accepted something the rest of us were still trying to process. On the drive home, neither of us spoke for a long time. Then, as we pulled into the driveway, he said quietly, "We'll handle it. Not I will. Not you should. We." And somehow, even in that moment, that word still held the same weight it had the night he came to get me. The months after the diagnosis didn't unfold the way I expected. There were no dramatic hospital scenes. No constant emergencies. Instead, everything slowed down. Deliberately. Uncle Harold adjusted his schedule first. He stepped back from daily operations, handing more responsibility over to me without making it feel like a burden. "You already know what to do," he said one afternoon, closing a file and sliding it toward me. "You've been doing it for a while." And he was right. By then, most decisions already came through me. Tenant negotiations, financial planning, long-term strategy. I had been preparing for this role long before either of us realized why. Still, knowing why changed the weight of it. At home, things became quieter. Not heavy. Just intentional. We had dinner together more often. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes about nothing at all. There were evenings where we just sat in the living room, the television on low, neither of us really watching. But the silence felt different than it used to. It wasn't empty. It was shared. There were doctor's appointments, of course, medications, adjustments, conversations with specialists that always sounded calm on the surface and final underneath. I went to as many as he would let me, not because he asked, but because I didn't want to miss time I couldn't get back. One evening in June 2024, I found him at the kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out in front of him, legal papers, neatly organized. He didn't try to hide them when I walked in. "Estate planning," he said simply. I nodded, pulling out a chair across from him. We didn't talk about details. That wasn't his way, but I understood what it meant. He was putting things in order, not out of fear, out of responsibility. Over the next few weeks, he met with his attorney several times, Margaret Morrison. I knew her name from past conversations, someone he trusted, someone thorough. Each meeting was scheduled calmly, no urgency in his tone, but no delays either. When I asked once if there was anything I needed to prepare for, he just shook his head. "Everything's taken care of," he said. "You focus on the business." That was it. No explanation. No preview. Just trust. Looking back, I realize now how intentional that was. He didn't want me worrying about what would happen later. He wanted me grounded in what was happening now. And so that's what I did. I kept things running. Reviewed contracts. oversaw budgets, met with tenants. Life didn't pause just because something difficult was approaching. In a strange way, that steadiness became an anchor. Because as long as things continued moving forward, I didn't have to fully face what was coming. But time doesn't stop, and neither does reality. By late February 2025, the conversations with doctors became shorter, clearer. There wasn't much left to discuss. On February 28th, I was sitting beside his bed at Swedish Medical Center, holding his hand. The room was quiet, machines steady, no urgency, just an ending that had already been understood. He looked at me once, not weak, not afraid, just present. And then, sometime in the early morning hours, he was gone, peacefully, exactly the way he had lived. And in that moment, the world didn't collapse. It just shifted. Again. But this time, I wasn't the same person I had been at 13. And I knew how to stand, even when everything else changed. The week after Uncle Harold passed moved in a kind of quiet blur. There were arrangements to handle, calls to return, documents to sign. People came and went, colleagues, longtime tenants, representatives from organizations he had supported over the years. Each of them carried a version of him I recognized. Steady, reliable, quietly generous. At the memorial service, I stood near the front, listening as people spoke about the man I had known in ways they never would. They talked about his business decisions, his discipline, the way he built something from nothing. But what stayed with me were the smaller things. The way he remembered people's names, the way he followed through on promises, the way he showed up consistently, without needing recognition. That was the version of him that had changed my life. After the service, the house felt different. Not empty. Just still. His presence had never been loud, so his absence wasn't either. It was subtle, felt in routines more than in moments. I went back to work 3 days later. Not because I had to, but because it was the one place that still felt structured. Predictable. Something I could move through without having to process everything all at once. A week after the memorial, I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Portland area code. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. Hello? A pause. Then, Diana. The voice hadn't changed. Not in tone. Not in cadence. 15 years collapsed into a single second. Sandra, I said. I didn't call her Mom. There was a brief silence on the other end, like she had expected something different. I heard about Harold, she said. I'm sorry for your loss. The words sounded right, but they didn't feel connected to anything real. The memorial was a few days ago, I replied. Oh, she said quickly. I didn't realize. I've been meaning to reach out. There it was. Not grief. Timing. I was also told there's going to be a will reading, she continued. Family usually attends those. It's appropriate. Appropriate. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the Seattle skyline. How did you hear about that? We have an attorney, she said. Victor Harrington. He made some calls. The name landed with a faint sense of recognition. Uncle Harold had mentioned it once briefly, in passing. Not favorably. I think it would be good if we were there, she added. As immediate family. Immediate. The word didn't sit right, but I didn't correct her. Not yet. Do what you feel is necessary, I said calmly. Another pause. Longer this time. I was hoping we could talk, she tried again. Before all of this, privately, I understood what that meant. Control the narrative. Set expectations. Reframe the past. No, I said. Simple. Clear. There wasn't anger in it. Just certainty. I don't think that's necessary. She exhaled softly, like she was adjusting her approach. Well, she said, we'll see you at the reading then. The call ended shortly after. I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand. Not shaken, not surprised, just aware. Because the timing wasn't a coincidence. They hadn't reached out during the diagnosis. They hadn't reached out during the final months. But now, with an estate involved, they were back. And this time, they weren't just reconnecting. They were positioning themselves. The only thing they didn't realize yet was that everything they thought they were walking into had already been decided long before they showed up. The next morning, I met with Margaret Morrison. Her office sat high above downtown Seattle, all glass and quiet precision. The kind of place where everything felt intentional, nothing rushed. nothing uncertain. She didn't waste time. Your parents have retained legal counsel, she said, sliding a document across the table. Victor Harrington has filed a preliminary challenge to the will. I read the first page slowly. Allegations of undue influence. Claims that I had isolated Harold. Language that reframed 15 years of distance into something calculated. It would have felt absurd if it weren't written so formally. They're asking for what? I asked, already knowing. 50% of the estate, Margaret replied. Half. Not a conversation, not a gesture, a demand. I let that sit for a moment, then looked up. Do they actually think they can win? Margaret folded her hands. That's not necessarily the goal. I knew what she meant. They're betting on pressure, she continued. If this goes into litigation, the estate could be tied up for over a year. Operational strain, legal costs. It becomes easier to settle than to fight. A strategy. Not based on truth, based on inconvenience. I leaned back slightly, considering it. Outside the window, the city moved like nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. There's something else, Margaret added. She reached into a folder and pulled out an older file, edges slightly worn, paper faintly yellowed. This was in Harold's records. She placed it in front of me. I glanced at the header, then read it again. And again. Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship, dated July 15th, 2010. My breath slowed. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I hadn't known it existed. 4 signatures. Sandra Myers, Richard Myers, Harold Myers. A notary. Legal. Final. They didn't just ask you to leave, Margaret said quietly. They formalized it. They signed away their parental rights. I stared at the page, the ink slightly faded with time. 15 years ago, I had been sitting on a porch, waiting. And inside that house, this had been happening. Not emotional, not impulsive, documented, deliberate. What does this mean for their claim? I asked, my voice steady despite the shift inside me. It changes everything, Margaret said. Legally, they severed their relationship to you. Any argument based on family connection becomes significantly weaker, especially if Harold structured his will accordingly. Of course he had. That realization settled slowly. Not as surprise. As recognition. He had known this might happen. He had prepared for it. There are 2 ways we can proceed, Margaret continued. We can negotiate, offer a settlement, avoid a public dispute. Or we move forward with the will reading as scheduled and present everything. Everything. The truth. Not just what happened recently, but what happened first. I closed the file carefully. For a moment, I thought about the easier option. The quiet one. Pay them. End it. Move on. But something about that felt incomplete. Not wrong. Just unfinished. They made this public, I said finally. Not me. Margaret nodded slightly. Yes. Then we don't hide anything. I met her gaze. No settlement. There was no hesitation in her response. Understood. As I stood to leave, I felt something settle into place. Not anger. Not anticipation. Just clarity. Because this wasn't about proving anything to them. It wasn't about winning. It was about letting the truth stand. Exactly where they had chosen to challenge it. The days leading up to the will reading were quieter than I expected. Not calm, just focused. There was no panic, no scrambling, just preparation. Elena sat across from me in my office, her laptop open, multiple documents spread across the table between us. 47 emails, she said, glancing up. From Harold to you over the years. Consistent tone, clear intent. He documented everything. I nodded. That sounded like him. Not emotional declarations. Not dramatic statements. Just steady records of what mattered. She turned her screen slightly so I could see. Messages about business decisions. Notes about property acquisitions. Updates where he referred to me not as a temporary responsibility, but as someone he trusted. None of this reads like coercion, Elena added. If anything, it shows the opposite. Independence. Choice. Respect. Exactly what they were trying to deny. We also reviewed the financials. 3 years of performance under my leadership as CFO. Growth, stability, increased portfolio value. Not exaggerated, just factual. Because that was the strongest position we had. Truth that didn't need to be framed. Later that evening, I met with Dr. Hayes. I hadn't planned to. But something about the weight of what was coming made me want a different kind of clarity. You're not preparing for a confrontation, she said after I explained everything. You're preparing for exposure. I considered that. They're the ones making claims, she continued. You're not creating a narrative. You're allowing the real one to be seen. There was something grounding in that distinction. Because it meant I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to defend my life. I just had to stand in it. What if I feel something when it happens? I asked. Not anger, but something close to satisfaction? She smiled gently. That's not cruelty, she said. That's alignment. The truth has a way of settling things internally. On Thursday night, I went home earlier than usual. The house felt the same as it always had. Quiet. Ordered. Familiar. I stood in the living room for a while, looking at the photos on the shelf. Graduation. First day at work. Moments that marked a life built after everything fell apart. Uncle Harold was in all of them. Not centered, but present. I thought about the last conversation we had about the future. You don't need to prove anything, he had said. You just need to be consistent with who you are. That stayed with me as I got ready for the next day. Not as reassurance, as direction. Because whatever happened in that conference room wasn't going to define me. It was just going to reveal what had already been true all along. I arrived at Margaret Morrison's office 15 minutes early. The city outside was gray, the kind of Seattle morning where everything feels muted, but inside, the conference room was already set. Long table. Clean lines. Documents arranged with quiet precision. I took my seat without saying much, placing my folder in front of me. Hands steady in a way that didn't come naturally, it came from practice. One by one, people filled the room. Representatives from organizations Uncle Harold had supported. Senior staff from Myers Property Holdings. Margaret, composed as always. This wasn't just a legal formality. It was a room full of witnesses. At 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. I didn't need to turn to know it was them. Sandra walked in first. Black dress, pearl necklace. The same controlled confidence she had worn the last time I saw her, like she believed she still understood how things worked. Behind her, Richard followed. Quieter, heavier somehow. Tiffany came next, eyes scanning the room quickly before settling somewhere else. And then Victor Harrington. Polished, measured, carrying certainty like it had already been earned. Sandra's eyes found me almost immediately. Diana, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. You're here early. I am. She stepped closer, lowering her tone. We should talk before this begins. There are things families should handle privately. I looked at her. Not the version of her I remembered. The version standing in front of me now, carefully composed, already calculating. There's nothing to discuss, I said calmly. Something flickered across her face. Brief. Controlled. Then gone. Margaret stood. It's time, she said. Everyone took their seats. Papers shifted. The room settled into silence. And in that silence, I felt something unexpected. Not tension. Not fear. Just stillness. Because this wasn't about what they were about to say. It was about what had already been written years ago. Quietly, intentionally, without any of them in the room. Margaret reached for the sealed envelope. And as her hand paused for just a second before opening it, I realized something with complete certainty. No matter how this moment unfolded, I wasn't that girl on the porch anymore. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I already had been. If you've made it this far, stay with this story. Some endings don't come from winning, they come from finally seeing clearly.